The session is titled, as part of our Research Methods Explainer series, and it is titled Data Analysis and Qualitative Research. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us Professor Sundari Anitha, who is Chair in Sociological Studies at the University of Sheffield. And we are very her work just her research interests lie in two areas: the problem of violence against women and girls, including domestic violence, forced marriage, sexual violence, and gender-based violence in university communities, and gender, race, and ethnicity in employment relations. So she has published 3 books and more than 60 journal articles, and we are very happy to invite her, and very happy and very fortunate that she has agreed to share her research learnings and share her lessons with us on this very specific session. Thank you so much. We welcome you, Professor Anitha, and I give over it to you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
I'll stop sharing and I'll let you share the screen. Yes.
Yeah, I'll share my screen now. And thank you for inviting me. And I'm really pleased. I think a lot of most exciting talks and are with students, and I feel really affirmed and hope. I mean, it's very bleak times today. US has bombed Iran. So in these bleak times, I always feel hope when I talk to young people and I hear about the kind of things you want to research, because I really feel positive. And like when I hear from people who are just setting out on that research journey on the kind of topics they're interested in. So I'm really pleased to be here to talking to all of you, and particularly from regional institutions. So I'll straight away start. So I'm assuming that you've had some sense of what qualitative research itself is, and my focus today is on presenting the findings. Yeah, 1 second, let's just make it a bit smaller. Yeah, and you can see, yeah? Okay.
Yes, Professor, we can see.
Okay, just trying to figure out moving the screen there. So what I want to talk today about is to give you an overview of methodological and practical issues in relation to analyzing your qualitative data. So I'm assuming that you've got that data and that steps over, but I'll have a little talk a little bit about the nature of the data itself, because that's the first step before you start thinking of what you might do with it. So what form, what quality of the data, what might you consider in your qualitative analysis, and a little bit about coding software. And what I want to do is, so the qualitative research and the ways of conducting it and analyzing data, there are many ways. So I want to focus on 4 today, predominantly because these are methods I have used, and also because these are the 4 common methods. And so you might want to think about other specific methods when you're organizing future sessions. So I want to talk about thematic analysis, content analysis, critical discourse analysis, and constructivist grounded theory as the 4 methods that I will talk about. But many of the themes I cover are relevant more widely to qualitative data analysis. So to start with, I think it's important to think about the purpose of this research and what are you trying to do with qualitative research, and what are you not trying to do. So there is still, and particularly in some institutions, when I travel in India, I have encountered this in some institutions, there is still sometimes this sense of a quantitative thinking which is applied to qualitative research. So that notion of positivism, of and of neutrality, and seeing bias and positionality as a problem is still something that comes through from conversations that I've had. So it's really important right at the beginning to be clear about what you're trying to do, and what is not possible to do, and what you're not even trying to do, because it's not desirable, it's not possible. So you are not trying to be representative of the wider population. This is a qualitative research. You are not trying to develop findings which are applicable to the whole population, or to all aspects of the problem you're trying to investigate. What you're trying to do with qualitative research is to understand particular experiences and contexts that shape them, and to generalize to theory. Yeah. So it's a theoretical contribution to understand a particular issue. And in this process, neutrality, objectivity is not possible, not desirable, and so what's important is the positionality of the researcher. So you're not invisible; you're very much present in the interview process, in the data analysis, and in the writing up, and that's something that often doesn't happen. So, so in lots of thesis that I examine, for example, there's a whole discussion of positionality in the early methods chapter, and then the findings are presented in a way in which the researcher is completely missing from the findings. There's no sense of how their presence shaped the data that or the narratives that were told to them. So researchers who are using this method need to be clear about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and include a clear description of the methods to enable reader to evaluate the trustworthiness of the research process. So you're not trying to prove that this is replicable. That's what quantitative researchers do. You're trying to make a case for why this is a valid method of research and how it's trustworthy. And you do that by talking about the research process. So you must demonstrate that the data, and if you're writing a proposal, you must demonstrate that your plan is consistent, precise. You've thought through how what data you'll gather. You'll thought through all the processes, and you thought through the methods. So credibility is what you're seeking in terms of other people's assessment of your method. You're not seeking replicability. So, in terms of the data itself, what's that is central to qualitative research. So, the quality of the data is absolutely central, um, and you need to think very carefully about how you will approach your data and gathering of your data to make sure it's as robust as possible. And for me, something that often disappoints me is when I hear researchers, early researchers, go to the field, and it's the whole process of recruiting participants is very difficult. But when you go to the field, I hear that they've just taken some very rough sketchy notes of the interviews and they've come back. That data is not analyzable. And I also edit journals, and I'm doing lots of for the current journal I edit. 70% of the submissions are desk rejected without review. So I'm sending back a lot of articles because the date some of them are salvageable with more analysis. So the problem lies in data analysis, but for many of them the problem is in the data quality of the data itself. It's really thin descriptions, very superficial. So what you're looking for in qualitative research is deeper, thick descriptions, and the intensity of that varies with the method that you might use. So key thought is, how might you record the interview? How might you have every little nuance captured? And if someone doesn't give consent to record, you really need to take detailed notes, and ideally your note keeper needs to be different from you, because you're listening, you're focusing on hearing what's being said, and if you're busy scribbling it down, it's very difficult to hear as well. So ideal is recording, and then you back it up and you transcribe it word by word. And an ideal transcription is one that is also alert to nuances, non-verbal cues. um, so so video recording is best for that. So I'll give this example is really useful. So it's about doctor-patient relationships and consent in and information sharing, and issues around power. So the first one, I'd suggest, yes, paracetamol is a good symptomatic treatment and you'll be fine. And the patient says, fine, okay, well, thank you very much. Sounds really straightforward. The second one, I'd suggest, yes, paracetamol is a good symptomatic treatment, slaps his thigh, and you'll be fine. Patient, fine, okay, hesitates, well, shrugs his shoulders and laughs, thank you very much. So it's very different, the two quotes. Same words, but the meaning is really completely the opposite. So that is what you miss when you don't have a detailed transcript. And this is about gestures, and there's one step removed if you just rely on memory. So that is the bedrock of your qualitative analysis. So if you don't start with doing this, then everything else I'm talking about is going to be irrelevant. So let's also talk about, get one or two other issues out of the way. So I use software to code data. I often use or mostly use NVivo, and I understand that in many institutional contexts in India you might not have access to it, but if you do, it's quite useful. So I use NVivo because I have all my data stored somewhere, transcripts, and then I can upload it to NVivo files for particular projects, and it deals with different types of data. You can have PDFs, photographs of archival sources, Word documents, you can have images, accessibility, you easily access all the data in one place. But key to NVivo is coding is you can analyze large amounts of data through the coding process. You can be consistent in terms of your analysis, and so it really works well with teams. So I've worked with teams of researchers on NVivo, which may not be relevant to you if you're doing your PhD, but so it's a sole researcher, but that's useful. Large number of interviews, it's really useful because you're thinking through the same categories and codes across every interview. So there's a consistency to your analysis. I think it helps me with theory building, and we can talk a little bit about it. It crucially, it offsets anecdotalism, which is when you enter the field, you might have a particular conception of an issue, and then in qualitative research, sometimes there's a tendency to seek anecdotes, scraps of data that affirm your initial sense of what was going on there. So it really helps you avoid that and look through all your data systematically and thoroughly. And that's when you really find surprising findings, and you find the unexpected, which is pretty much the whole point of doing such research. If you knew what you were going to find, what's the point of doing that research? So but it's not the panacea, it's not the solution for everything. It takes time to become proficient in NVivo, for example, or other tools that you might use. Sometimes some people find it hard to navigate. And my favorite bugbear with these software tools is people sometimes in the section on data analysis, and this is as a journal editor and reviewer, the data was analyzed in NVivo or by NVivo. And I'm like, really? Hopefully, we're very far away from the day when AI analyzes through NVivo the data that we submitted. No, NVivo doesn't analyze anything, you analyze it. NVivo is just a tool for helping you analyze your data. And there's some problems with NVivo. Once you code data, you organize your data in codes that some of it is deductive, some of it is inductive. So you have conceptions of these are the themes that you want to code, and then as you look through your data, themes emerge from the data as well, codes emerge from the data. So for some people, it requires a constant going back to your codes for at least the first several interviews till the codes stabilize, because you have a set of codes based on your research questions, and then you add to it based on what you're reading in from your interviews. And then after first several interviews, the codes stabilize. Some people use it and the codes have shifted a lot, and they don't go back to the early ones that they coded to recode it. So it depends on how well you use it, whether you want to use software, but I find it useful. Okay, so let's talk about methods that are used. So Mason identified what is used in PhDs in the UK a while back. So case study was a very common approach. Grounded theory, 174 used it. Discourse analysis, content analysis, life history methods, action research, and others. And in all of that, sample size is what Mason was looking at. What sample size do you need for data saturation in PhD? And you can see it really depends on the method you use. So for example, life history, which is my method, 35 is what PhD students used when it was life history methods. Content analysis, these are still larger than what I would use. I would suggest for PhD students. For life history, I'd say 15 to 20 interviews would be quite enough if they are really in-depth rich interviews. But I mean, you'd have to ask case study, is this really qualitative? 179? That doesn't quite sound like. So these are quite large figures, but we can talk about it in questions if you want to ask about how many, when is data saturation. So the four methods that I want to talk about is thematic analysis, which is the most widely used, very poorly demarcated, very acknowledged. It's the term that gets lumped in submissions to journals when there is very little clarity on how the analysis was done. Content analysis, then critical discourse analysis and grounded theory. There's lots of others that I won't have time to talk about. So let's have a quick look at some broader general principles before I move to those methods. So all of those methods entail some form of coding, which means adding labels to segments of your data that depict or map what each segment of that data is about. So it's the basis of all qualitative analysis. You look at your text and then you categorize your text according to different codes. What it means is you are interacting with your whole transcript in quite detail. And the way you do it is linked to your overall method. So sometimes you determine the code in advance. So this is the classic content analysis, and thematic analysis often uses that, where it's a deductive method. So the codes may be determined by a research question, for example, and that's a commonly used method. Codes may also be formed through your analysis. So, as you read your transcripts, you discover something new that's happening. And through that process, you realize that your older codes were not adequate. You need to have new codes. So, you do that. So, for example, in my current research, which is on domestic violence in young women's intimate relationships in India. So this is young women who are in non-marital relationships, uh, and it's about. I'm looking at various things, but among them, I'm looking at the forms of domestic violence, and I have a sense of what codes I would need because I've done research on domestic violence for a long time. So there are these categories, these forms of violence like physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual coercion and control, coercive and controlling behavior. So these are the categories that I had, but as I started reading the transcripts and as I was doing the interviews, I realized something new was emerging, which I hadn't encountered before. So, young women were telling me about how in university communities, their boyfriends would coerce them and pressurize them into doing their assignments, into doing their PhD proposal. And as these accounts emerged, I have had to create a new code, which I haven't I haven't quite thought how to conceptualize it and what to call it, but I think the placeholder is something like intellectual abuse or abuse of women's intellectual labor. And I haven't encountered this anywhere before, and this is something new that's emerging. So your codes have to be, I think there's an element of inductive that is essential. So you can't fix your codes for qualitative research of any quality, any standard. You have to be open to finding out new things, and that's how your research is original, because you don't, and research that affirms previous findings is essential. A lot of the world of research is about affirming, confirming existing findings, but there's an important element of originality, which is a PhD is judged on making an original contribution. So inductive is a really key aspect of coding in qualitative research. All the coding may take place at the end of the research, or there are some forms of some methods like grounded theory where it takes place in stages throughout, and I'll talk about it later. Coding of the text may relate to longer or shorter elements of the text. So, discourse analysis, for example, may just pick on a particular phrase that's occurring, and that might be the text that's being analyzed. Narrative or life history interviews, for example, there are bigger sections of texts that are typically analyzed because of the the focus on narrative in life history methods. So those are kind of differences in terms of coding, but the overall method process is quite similar. So quickly, in terms of you thinking about it in term workflow, but I've talked about NVivo, and you can apply it to other even manual coding. So you gather all your data, import data, you read and query your data, you think about what's going on. And when I did my PhD in the 1990s, I would print out all my interviews, all my notes, and then I had different color marker pens and a code with the what each one meant, and I'd be highlighting bits of text. So it's just similar thing that I'm doing here, but using this NVivo. So you look at the data carefully, you try and through that process you code it, scraps of the data, and that reading the data, analyzing it, coding it, again reading the data, analyzing, coding it. It's a process that is not a one-off thing. For good research, it has to happen more than once. And that's because often if you don't know something, then you can't hear what's being said in the narrative, in the interview. So when I go back, and now I'm in the process of writing a book on transnational marriage abandonment. And we did the interviews a long time back. The research finished in 2016, and I'm revisiting the data to do this, write this book. And I'm understanding uh, parts of women's narratives that was said, and I had read it several times, but I didn't recognize that something significant was being said. So as our understanding improves, as our understanding widens, we can see more, we can hear what women are telling us, or what our respondents are telling us. So it's not a one-off step, and that's how you have a more critical and nuanced analysis by going back to it. And often it helps to have a gap and then go back. You've done a bit of reading, you're able to recognize more. So thematic, that's the first one. So what is thematic analysis? What's this framework? So it's a method for systematically identifying, organizing, and offering insight into uh, themes, common themes, a pattern in the across the data set. So what thematic analysis commonly looks for is a pattern. Yeah. So collective and shared meanings and making sense of commonalities. So thematic analysis typically tries to bring out what was common in across the different respondents' accounts. Some of the thematic analysis also, I think less so, it would be good if there was more of that, also pays attention to the outliers, what was different. But in thematic analysis, which is not, it's not always quality, I'd say, is very variable. So those which are of, say, poor quality, there is very little sense of why are they the outliers? Why was this experience different? And you can only understand it by locating it in its context, locating that person's experiences in the context of their lives. And sometimes thematic analysis is of semi structured interviews where there's very definite questions. So you may not have the data to help you understand why there was this small, very contrary set of accounts. So it depends on, again, the quality of the data. So it's you don't just find look for unique elements. Unique elements are presented within a broader account of what's common. You it data is it's about summarizing large data sets. So often it's used for, say, case studies or large tranches of data. I think it's one of the most widely used, but I agree with Braun and Clark. It's poorly demarcated, rarely acknowledged. It's something that's lumped. You hear we did thematic analysis, and that's it. They don't really explain what they did, how they did it. So I'm really wary of this method because it seems to be the term that's used when not much thought was given to how data analysis was done. So it can be done well, but I think it's not really. It's on the whole, I'm skeptical about how people use this method. It's associated with work of Ritchie and Spencer, A lot of policy focused work, evaluations use this. So it's like quick research often uses this. It's strongly linked to topic guide or list of questions used in semi-structured interviews. So often what thematic analysis does is, there were 10 questions asked in the research. So they code the data according to the 10 questions. So basically they code it as each question, all the answers to that question lumped together, and the next question, all the answers lumped together. So often it's used in that very quick way, and you edit each response to each question and just present it. But you can do more with it. So it uses 6 stages. You familiarize yourself with the data, you formulate codes, but sometimes you don't, you just use the questions as codes. And your themes are generated as each code is the question, which is a theme. Sometimes themes review also doesn't happen. Defining and naming the themes, ideally it should happen, but often it doesn't happen, and then you form the report. So in poor quality work, what's happening is you jump from the first to the final step, because it's a quick fix way to analyzing the data, but it can be a lot more than that. So let's look at, this was one of the better ones, which used thematic analysis. So this and in this article is about men's clothing and image and appearance, and how men manage that process. So the idea that, I suppose, behind it is the notion of doing gender. So West and Zimmerman, for example, wrote this really famous article about how all of us do gender in the everyday life that we live. And I suppose implicit in that is the idea that we can also undo gender in the way in which we live. And so they looked at clothing practices. And through thematic analysis, they revealed 4 key themes: practicality of clothing choices, lack of concern about appearance, use of clothing to conceal or reveal the body, and use of clothing to fit cultural ideals. And this was open interviews. It wasn't like 10 semi structured questions and everything's coded according to each question. So, this was an example of good thematic analysis. And so, if you have a chance, I don't know what your access is to materials. This is an early good example of using this method for qualitative research. Okay, the second one. How am I doing for time? Do I need to rush?
No, you're
No.
okay. You're fine. You're fine. That's all.
Okay. So next one is content analysis. It's used to analyze the presence, meaning, relationships of words, themes, and concepts. So content analysis is about sets of texts. So it's making inferences from those texts about what's going on in those texts, the messages that are being conveyed through that text. And what it does is, it tries to pull out the themes within a given document, what they mean, by looking at the relationship between the words in that document and the underlying concepts which might inform the words and the ordering of the words. You can also make inferences about culture and the time and the context of that text. So when you start doing that, it's also used in connection. It's also used in conjuncture with the critical discourse analysis. So, and I'll talk a little bit about that method. So what you do in content analysis is you have a set of research questions or objectives. You select your sample, and then you develop your categories through which you want to analyze the content of that textual data that you have. And you simplify that data, because it's often, for example, I've done content analysis of newspaper articles. Often it's done in media analysis. You're trying to understand what are the themes in, say, media representation of asylum seekers in the UK, for example, or I've researched on media representations of forced marriage. So there's large amounts of text that you gather if you look at newspaper articles. So you want to simplify your units of analysis, and then through the codes that you've developed, and some of it is deductive, some is inductive, you want to prepare a list of codes and then apply it, analyze the data. And often at this process, if you're working with other people, you work together to develop your codes. And that's one crucial step in qualitative research in teams, which improves the validity and reliability of your analysis, because then you're saying there's two of us, we arrived at the codes together, and there was the first person who coded the data, and then the second person cross-coded it till we arrived at a common understanding of that data, of how to analyze it. But if you're doing a PhD, then it's just you. So what critical analysis can do is it's an unobtrusive research technique. So often it works with existing data sets. So you can look at speeches, for example, public speeches, parliamentary debates are really useful for this. You can look at media reports. You can look at policy documents. So often this method is used for research that's relatively safe, because you can it's not reliable on doing interviews with which requires you to go to the field, and issues of access, how might that interview turn out. So it's low cost at that initial stage of gathering the data. Yeah. So but it's labor intensive in terms of analyzing that data, but you don't need to spend money on doing the field work. You can much of this data, for example, parliamentary debates, are accessible. They're public resources. The limits of that is you can only infer, if you're just using the text, you can only infer based on what's in that text. So, and there's some methods of content analysis which really are, I mean, the bane of my life. So some researchers do content analysis by looking just at the frequency of words, and then they give you word cloud in their journal article, and it's pretty much on its own, it's pointless. So it's not, some researchers use it as a quantitative method, or use those ideas about it, and that really fails to realize the purpose of this research, and doesn't capture any meaning, and the same word may be used in very different contexts and may mean very different things. So you have to really think about, for me, that would really be not a reliable or valid way of using content analysis. It's a qualitative method, and you might have one little reference to frequency, but that's as far as it goes if you're using it to understand meaning. So let's look at what we did. So this was my this was an article I wrote in like a long 16 years back, 15, no 10 years back, on forced marriage in British newspapers, how it covered the problem. So I'll have a quick long text. Okay, I'll read it. So I used both textual data, and I also used images that accompanied that data. And this is becoming increasingly hard. So when you see media analysis now, because a lot of researchers take the extra shortcut of going to the online sources and downloading the text newspaper articles from online sources, LexisNexis, what you lose is you lose the position of that article in the wider newspapers, whether it was in front page, where was it positioned, what was next to it. So sometimes the article itself may seem okay, but it's next to. So for example, a crime story where the main headline says asylum seeker does this, and then you put four other articles around it about channel crossings, boats, migrants coming to the UK by boats, illegal migrants. Certainly meaning is formed in the context of where it's located in the newspaper, and images. So often people don't really, nowadays when it becomes an easy method, you don't see all of that. So I think you really lose something. So we went back to the original source of each of the articles for one particular section of this. So we managed to get some of the other traces that get removed in LexisNexis. So this one was a big cover story in Observer, which is a Sunday magazine accompanying a newspaper, the main Guardian newspaper in the UK, which is one of the main broadsheets. So it had a photograph of survivors that accompanied a cover story on forced marriage. And all the women, like there were 7 or 8 women whose stories featured in this very big spread, they were dressed in black clothes, Western clothes. And we argued that this was an image that really departed from it emphasized their departure from their original communities. So black Western clothes. And even the text reinforced this. And one of the survivors is quoted as saying, "My father didn't leave his traditions behind at Heathrow." And similarly, Daily Mail had another article where about a survivor of forced marriage who left her family and then went on to marry her white boyfriend. And it lauded her courage and said today she prides herself on being a thoroughly modern English woman with her fashionably streaked hair, elegantly painted nails, and designer wardrobe of must-have designs. She looks every inch the part. And we argue that this framing and selection of the narratives and the photographs reinforces the commonplace view that migrants should abandon their cultural traditions, which are represented as a key cause of forced marriage. So in the UK, forced marriage is constructed as a cultural problem, as an essential feature of racially minoritized communities. Um, and violence against white women is seen as an individual problem. So it's individual pathology. These are a few bad apples, few bad men who do bad things to women. It's nothing to do with us, with the rest of us who are very progressive, egalitarian. But when it happens to racially minoritized women, different forms of violence, including forced marriage, it's about that their whole culture. This is how they are. This is what brown men do to brown women. So we were arguing about the essentialist constructions of forced marriage, and and uh, and how victims, survivors, are those who've left or fled a forced marriage situation are women who've left behind their culture, because to leave forced marriage you have to leave your culture, because it's all about your culture. So this is one example of how from that text you might arrive at a conceptualization. So this notion of essentialization of particular forms of violence is the conceptual, it's a theory, a contribution, but this is the steps. So I hope that kind of makes sense. So again, there's another example. Content analysis looked at misogyny in rap music, and it started with quantitative. It was present in 22% of this many songs, this many rappers, and then looked at particular terms. And then, because it looked at particular terms and examined it in greater depth, and didn't just do a word cloud, it looked at how the terms bitch and hoe are used in rap, and then argued against common sense constructions of all of this rap music, which is racialized in the UK context and other contexts as misogynist, which it is, but there's a connection to racial context, and argued that depends on the context how it's used in the lyrics, and some of it was used in a critical way, some of it was used in an ironic way, or as reclaiming a term and subverting it. So it looks at some of those issues. Okay, discourse analysis. I don't have that much time, do I?
Professor, you can take like 15 minutes more. That should be, if that is okay with you.
Yeah, so 15 minutes should be enough. So discourse analysis looks at the level above the text. So content analysis is looking closely at the text. So far I've talked broadly about research methods, qualitative research, and importance of data. I talked a bit about coding and how you might organize your data. And then I talked about thematic analysis and content analysis. I'm going to talk about discourse analysis now, and then about my favorite, which is grounded theory, constructivist grounded theory. So discourse analysis looks at three layers. You analyze the text, so critical elements in the text, which is very similar to content analysis. It also looks at the wider process, the context within which the documents are produced, and an element of social analysis, the wider political and social structures where documents and institutions are immersed, and how might it be interpreted in that context. So, what it tries to do is understand the politics of producing meaning. How is meaning produced, and what's the politics behind it? And central to critical discourse analysis is how power is produced, how ideas circulate, how ideas are created, how they circulate, how they are held in place through an analysis of text. Speeches, particularly political speeches, for example, uses this as well. So Fairclough writes about it, and this is an example. I won't read through it, but it's a foreword by the UK then Prime Minister Tory about capitalism and rule on a white paper, which looked at their policies in relation to neoliberal changes. And Fairclough analyzes this and analyzes the techniques that are used. So the modern world is swept by change. New technologies emerge constantly. New markets are opening. There are new competitors, but opportunities. Our success depends on how well we exploit our most valuable assets, knowledge, skill, and creativity. So Fairclough argues that global capitalism, the neoliberal model of it, is constructed as external. The world is swept by this change as if we have nothing to do, and the Tories, as if they had nothing to do with this global capitalism and the neoliberal model. It's unchangeable. It's like the storm that's sweeping, and so either you respond to the storm and take advantage of whatever in what you can, or you get swept. And unquestionable. So it's a fact of life, and this is what we do. So analyzed how certain discourses through the language, certain discourses are being presented, and then certain responses and interventions are constructed as inevitable. And so there's no questioning, no critical examination of, is this the only way? What if there was something else? So it was quite interesting, that article. You could have a look. Okay, last one, grounded theory. So grounded theory is a method that's concerned with generation of theory, which is grounded in the data that has been analyzed. So it's an old method, 1967. It's an iterative process. So you collect the data and you start analyzing it. And as you start analyzing it, you carry on collecting more data. And your initial interaction with the field informs your subsequent analysis. So different methods, both qualitative and quantitative, are used for this, and the goal is to develop theory inductively based on the data that you discover. So you don't go with preconceived hypothesis that you're testing. And initially, the grounded theory, so Glaser and Strauss and early iterations of grounded theory argued that the researcher goes with an open mind. You just look at the data, and and your findings and your conceptualization emerges from that data. You don't have any assumptions. So I use grounded theory, but I'm critical of that because as a feminist, positionality is important for me, and there's a whole body of feminist critique and building of this concept of grounded theory to constructivist grounded theory. So I'll skip over this. I'll share the slides later so you can have a look. So this is again similar coding and how that works. So it's based on constructivist grounded theory, is based on the idea of grounded theory, but advances and critiques it. That the critical part of it, the part that draws from grounded theory is that reality is socially constructed through interactions between people, and that means interactions between the researcher and the person who's being researched. And it critiques the idea that we arrive at a theory based on the data alone, and that this data is uncontaminated by my baggage, my conceptual baggage, or my positionality. So feminists deny that that's possible, or that it's even desirable, and they argue that any data is co-created between the researcher and the researched, and your own positionality very much shapes that data collection and analysis. But what's common in the old grounded theory and constructivist grounded theory is this constant interaction with the data gathering while being involved in analysis. So you do both at the same time, and you move back from thinking through your concepts, gathering the data, transcribing, starting to code, and then going back to the field. And so it emerges through that process. And narrative analysis, I use it a lot in conjunction with critical grounded theory. So this is life history interviews. So gathering very in-depth, rich narratives about accounts of people's lives. And the aim is not just to identify what is happening in their life, the content of their narratives, the events that are happening. Equally important is the context in which the narrative is told to you. So as a researcher, so again, this is where the positionality comes in. So you're analyzing at two layers. So the story that they're telling you, this is what happened to me, this is the circumstances of my childhood, this is how the marriage proposal arrived, this is what the marriage was like. So you're analyzing the content, but you're also thinking of what is it that they're telling you and why are they telling you that? and how do people talk about their experiences. So so that both at the textual and the social and cultural level, you're looking at how narratives are constructed. And I'll give you an example of that. So from our research on transnational marriage abandonment, which is experiences of women who have migrated to marry. So we looked at this research in India. So Indian women who migrated to marry men, NRIs who are settled abroad, and often found that these men, following domestic violence and abuse, abandoned the women back in India, or they never intended to take them abroad. The marriage was to secure a permanent, lifelong domestic reproductive labor, domestic help for their parents who were in India. So we did this research. We're writing about it, and these two quotes are examples of what women said to us. So one of the women said, "They made me do all the housework. I didn't really mind that, but they didn't treat me like I was family." So when I analyze this, I'm thinking, what's going on here? Yes, she did all the housework. As soon as the marriage, 2 weeks after the wedding, they sacked everyone, all the domestic servants in the house, all domestic workers, and she had to do everything. Um, but she was telling me, I didn't really mind that. What I didn't like is they didn't treat me like family. So alongside this, what was happening is she had separate cups for her use. She couldn't use the plates that people in the family were using. She had plastic plates for her. So the othering that was happening to her was what's common in many Indian households with domestic workers. So she was saying, this is what I minded. I didn't mind the housework. So I am thinking that the extent of housework that she's done, does she? So I have to think, why is she saying that she doesn't mind the housework? Because she's also telling me how intensive the labor was and how disproportionate it was. So my analysis is, what's that I didn't really mind doing in that quote? And my analysis of that is that there is a certain construction of the good daughter in law that's being deployed there, because she's very aware, and this came up again and again. Women were very aware of the responsibility they had for domestic labor and were trying to position themselves as good women in a context where they were blamed for the end of that marriage, that there must be something wrong with you, that he didn't take you abroad, that he abandoned you. So in that context, they're constructing themselves as good women who didn't mind all the housework. What they minded was this. So there were two levels. There's a account of hurt that they're narrating, that they didn't treat me like family, but there's also some other work this quote's doing. This other quote, I don't even go out to buy vegetables from the vendor. So an abandoned woman in Punjab is telling us about her life, and she says, therewala, people who come to the door selling vegetables. She said, I don't even open the gate and go there to say help us to buy the vegetables, but she did come to the gate to open the gate for us. So it wasn't that she's always inside the house and she never came to the gate. So what's that doing again? Was she's again constructing herself. Her neighbors are blaming her. That within the community, there's a construction of the abandoned woman as somehow to be blamed for what's happened. So in that context, she's telling us that she's such a good woman, and she's operating within the restrictions of she's limiting herself to the private sphere. So Luisa Pasarini says the guiding principle for life histories could be that all autobiographical memory is true. It's up to the interpreter to discover in which sense, where, and for what purpose it's true. And this became clearer to us when we spoke to practitioners, lawyers, and organizations. And pretty much the common refrain among them was that these women are crazy to go abroad, meaning it's their fault this has happened to them. They've brought it upon themselves. And the women were constructing themselves in particular way in responses to those, to push back against those dominant constructions which blamed them for their victimization. So that's the level of analysis which is about the interaction. So this is what they're telling us. This is what that is doing in terms of their constructions about the self. So it's beyond the incidents that they're accounting to us at that level. So last two slides. How do you present your research in qualitative when you do a qualitative analysis? Direct quotes from participants, textual extract is an essential component of the final output. You've got to do that. I've had recently some well, desk rejects, which pretty much had just like phrases. They just had two word extracts within their texts, so there was hardly any sense, and that wasn't content analysis, sense of the voices of the research participants. So depending on the methods, you can have shorter quotes or longer quotes, but you really need to rely on your research participants' voices. But you can't just, and this again happens, have lots of quotes and that's it, that's the findings. You have to embed that within the analytical narrative. You have to unpack what's going on, what's being said here, how do you interpret it, and locate it within the scholarship to and that's how you convince readers of the validity and merit of your analysis. If you just do extract of the quotes, it's not analysis, it's a flat descriptive account. And when you and you don't just describe what's being said in the quote, they can say it for themselves, you don't need to reiterate it. What you do is you try and theorize the significance or underpinning meanings behind what they're saying, the implications of that for your theorization, for your for that problem, for understanding that problem. And in that process, you also utilize the literature, the scholarship, to make sense of what they're saying, where it affirms existing scholarship, and sometimes it pushes the boundaries of the existing scholarship and shows you new ways of understanding that phenomenon. So last one. So qualitative research can offer a deep understanding of lived experience. You can analyze this experience in the context of your research participants' location within intersecting social relations of power. It's a very powerful method. For me, life history method is really does enables that, because I'm looking at the broader life and locating that person's experience of, say, domestic violence or taking part in a strike in the context of their different social relations of power. um, it's a valid, it can be valid, valuable, trustworthy way of conducting research, but without care, it can too often become mired in anecdotalism, generalizations, and homogenization of data, where everything is put together without any sense of the context within which the data has meaning. And so some of the thematic analysis does that. So what you need to think about is, how will you avoid this flattening out of human experience that some can happen, and how will you aim for rich, in-depth, and nuanced understanding? And what you really need to do is you need to convey the methods you use to conduct the research, and particularly how you analyze the data, in order to convince the reader of the validity and quality of your research. So sometimes in papers you see, I conducted this themes, thematic analysis, and this is what emerged. That's not enough. That's not enough to tell me, convince me of the validity. So the time needs to be spent on outlining that process in order to convince people that this is a valid method. Here's some of the references, and that's it. I'll stop sharing and see if you have any questions. Thank you for listening. That was long.
Thank you so much, Professor. This was so, so, so helpful. I mean, this was so detailed and rich, and I'm very sure that it was very, very helpful for our participants. I now invite question and answers from our participants. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat box if you wish to do that. If you're comfortable, you can also raise your hand and then you can unmute yourselves and ask your question directly. Please be comfortable in asking your questions, whatever basics to basic question or as detailed as you want to go. Please use this time for that. Until we have, yes, yes, Professor, please go ahead.
There's no silly question. So if you think
Yes.
something's too basic, too obvious, and you should know it, be convinced that there's someone else or many people who have the same question, and they're feeling the same. So if you ask, you're not just doing it for yourself, you're doing it for others as well.
Absolutely. So until we have the questions coming up in chat box, and I'm sure there would be, I can go ahead and maybe this is something that you raised in the very beginning, Professor, and because I know this has come up in previous sessions that I'm raising this question, it's about data saturation. As to in qualitative research, when do we know that we have reached a point of data saturation? And any advice on that, because you've done such extensive research, would be so helpful. You spoke briefly about it, and I would love to hear more on it. Also, when we are writing, then what kind of voices we need to adopt, because ebook, you can't be claiming that people think this way. It cannot come across as being representative of a larger category, as you were saying. So what languages we should be careful about when we are then presenting and writing this analysis? So I'll begin with that, and I can already see questions coming in.
Okay, so data saturation. And what's the second thing that you asked?
Ways of writing that. So, for example, when we often write, suppose most of our participants did say something, we eventually tend to write as, so people think this way, but it's not still speaking for a larger category. Eventually, you have taken a small site in that this 15, 20 participants have said so. So, what kind of
Okay.
ways of phrasing are important that we should avoid per se, or be writing about ways? Yeah.
Okay, so data saturation. So it really depends on your method. So but the key principle of data saturation is when no new themes, no new findings are emerging. That so so there's a point at which very similar narratives are similar accounts are emerging. So nothing new is emerging in that final few interviews. So that's the point at which you know that there's it's time to stop. And it really depends on your topic and on the diversity of the sample that you're trying to achieve. So for some topics, so I do research on, say, domestic violence, and now this particular research that I'm doing is on young women's experiences of violence in intimate relationships. It's going to be the first research. It is the first research on this topic in India. So immediately, the problem I have is that there is nothing on which I'm building, right? So usually as PhD students, that's unlikely. You are building on an existing body of scholarship. So therefore, much of the data that you gather will affirm existing findings, and it'll be familiar to you. If you are familiar with the field and the scholarship, you will hear accounts, you will say, yes, yes, that's familiar. But there'll be some parts of the accounts that are new to you, and there'll be a point at which nothing new is emerging. So that point is reached. But if it's a new body of research, entirely new, then everything is new, right? So it takes longer to reach the point of data saturation. So though I use life history interviews, and for a PhD, I'd say if it was really if you did in-depth interviews, if the way you did interviews allowed people the chance to talk openly and freely, and life history interviews, I mean, this one, they're mostly between 2 to 5 hours, which is unusually long, but partly it's because it's such a stigmatized topic. So many women, this was the first time they were able to talk about it. Normally, usually it'd be 2 to 4 hours. So if you're able to achieve those kind of in-depth accounts, then for PhD, between 8 to 15 would be enough of life history interviews. But for both my research, transnational marriage abandonment was the first research on that topic. And then it was in Punjab, Gujarat, and Delhi. So again, there's differences to do with the region. And then there were different types of abandonment. So some women were taken abroad and brought back and abandoned. Some were never migrated and waited to migrate. And then there were others who were not brought back, but who were abandoned in the other country and fled, came back to India as a first step to figure out what to do, and then realized they couldn't go back. So there's three categories across three sites, and then no research on this. So I ended up doing around 57 life history interviews because new things kept emerging. And so it was very hard to reach a point where nothing new was emerging. And the same is happening in the current research. So I've done 43 interviews, and I'm probably going to stop, also because I know now what categories I haven't got data on. So I'm also mindful of different castes, religion, rural urban location of women, class positions. But I know that, for example, I have very little accounts of women from the northeast of India, in a context where there are discourses about the sexual promiscuity of women from northeast, which construct them in particular ways and therefore make it harder for their accounts of violence to be believed. So I know there's this issue, and I've tried to extend my sample in that way. It's not happening. So I'm going to stop and then hope that someone else will pick up that part, and I will signpost that there's a gap here. And so if I've now encountered a group of women from the northeast who wanted to be interviewed, I would do those interviews because I will find new things. So I have a sense of I've reached saturation with this sample. If I get new categories, I know I'll find something new. So it's those judgments that you have to make, and it's quite tricky because when you apply for funding, you have to say how many people will you interview, and so you usually, depending on the method, you give a number. So I said I'd do 25 to 30, which is a good amount for life history interviews. But with life history, you also triangulate it with other. So I'm talking to practitioners, and I often do a session like on life history methods. If you want, I can do one on that later in one of your future sessions. But but I said I'd do 25 to 30, and by 25 30, I was nowhere near saturation. So I carried on. So depending on your methods, there are different saturation points, and so you have to read about your method and saturation and figure out. The second thing, writing X thinks Z. So how do you do that? What you don't do is you don't homogenize and you say all women. This is what happened. So if you're talking about coercive control, for example, then you highlight the forms of coercive control, but you locate that. So if I'm doing, say I'm doing life history interviews, so one form of coercive control that was deployed when women tried to leave the relationship because they realized it's abusive is men would threaten to tell their families that they were in a relationship. So it's a control that's used to prevent women from leaving, and it's rooted in the clandestine nature of that relationship. So I will talk about this form of control, and then I will analyze what's going on here. Why is this control being deployed? What's the context in which this control is effective? And that's the context in which that woman is located. She's from a rural family where her family have funded her education. She's come to a university in Hyderabad or Delhi. They are supporting her, and they've said on the condition that you're good, yeah, and so it'll upend. So I explain what it means for her, but I can only do that by understanding and explicating the context in which that control can work. So it's very much specific to her, but there are, that was a common theme. So then I'd be talking about other ways in which this control worked. For some women, this control took the form of having receipts of her abortion, which they could send to the family. For others who were in very rural location, it was just a picture of them standing together. That was just as effective. So because that was enough for her family to bring her back home and marry. So those are different contexts in which what is controlling is shaped by her context. So I unpack the meaning. I don't generalize saying this is what happens across relationships in India. But what I can theorize is that conducive contexts for this abuse are created by sociocultural norms around women's sexuality and virginity.
Yes.
So that's
Yeah.
my step to theorization. So yeah. Does
Yeah.
that make sense, the answer?
Absolutely, it does. I mean, it completely makes sense. I do get what you're trying to say. Thank you so much. Now we'll move on to the questions. So Aishwarya has asked how to avoid flattening of data and not miss complex nuances, what precautions to take. Also, it is a new thing for me that non-verbal cues should also be documented in data, how to represent it in analysis. So there are two questions, how to not miss nuances and how to record non-verbal cues and represent them in analysis.
So how not to flatten? One way that flattening happens is that so on the same thing on coercive control, I could just have extracts of quotes on 8 extracts about different forms of coercive control, and then at the end say coercive control was commonly documented in my sample, and then move on to the next. So I've flattened all the experiences into one broad category, and that's what flattening looks like. Or I could look at each quote and think about what's the context in which that form of control occurred. What did it mean for her, given that these are this is a social location, class, caste, this is an intercaste marriage, or all of those things will explain what it means. So flattening is when there's a bunch of quotes put together and then a broad paragraph summarizing that. And so often I see that in articles that I desk reject. So non-verbal cues, that is the ultimate. If you start doing that, then your analysis is really rich. And that example showed how it might be. So if you have video recordings, then you're able to do that. If someone's really hesitant in the beginning, you make little notes to capture what was going on. If the family was present and the account was of one particular kind, and then when someone left the room, the account changed, you make a note. So then you're able to signpost what was going on that shifted the uh, account. So you do it to different extent that's possible. If you're audio recording and someone doesn't allow it, then it's not possible. But there may be silences, and they may be and then they tell you something, so you can record this. You can say, okay, there was a pause and she's thinking about how much to tell you, and then she's saying something. So if you're able to do that, it's great, but it's not always possible.
Thank you so much, Professor. I can see Basudev has raised their hand. So could you please go ahead and ask your question? And we take further questions in the chat box.
Yes, am I audible?
Hmm.
So thank you so much, Professor. Actually, I have a small question. So actually, I'm dealing with some sort of folk theatre studies, and actually, I'm dealing with two set of data. One set of data is archival, and the another set of data is some interviews. So, Professor, actually, I am currently planning to do a PhD. So actually, I am formulating a writing sample. So, Professor, I'm just confused ki how to deal with two data. I mean, how should I present the data which are, I mean, both the archival sources and the interview part can go hand in hand and can have a very detailed analysis of the particular phenomenon. I just want,
So you,
yeah.
so you can use in the same study different methods for different sets of data. So, for example, it's very common to say that you're going to use narrative analysis for life history interview data, and then thematic analysis for practitioner perspectives. So you can combine different forms of analysis. So for your data, because it's very different, I'd do that.
Yes, actually, Professor, I was doing that. Is there? I mean, sometimes like suppose I put some sort of theme. I mean the kind of data that I've gathered from secondary sources, and the kind of data that I've gathered from the interviewing the performers. So I just try to make it in certain themes. But should I mean, can I use both data at the same time? Secondary data and the primary data. I mean, could you give any?
Yeah. So if you're
Suggestion on that?
using, yeah, so if you're structuring your analysis thematically, then it's based on the argument that you're presenting, and that argument can be bolstered by presenting data from two different sources, which might be. And so what you're looking at is you're trying to achieve triangulation of your findings. So you're thinking the archival material suggests this, and then something that someone you've interviewed, what it says confirms that your interpretation. So that's how you'd use it. So you'd use when you're doing thematic analysis. So for something that I wrote on child marriage, forced marriage in the US, for example, in white communities in the US, I use narrative analysis and practitioner accounts. So it was analyzed, it was presented thematically. So narrative accounts had a very different, it was in-depth accounts with the context and trying to explain what's happening. And then practitioner accounts, because they were semi-structured, it was confirming because the account that was presented by the woman, it was small sample, just 7 life history interviews. So the sample size was small, but the practitioner said this is something we commonly see. For example, gay and lesbian people's experiences of forced marriage is in this context. So that's confirming a quote that's outlining this particular form of coercion that they experience, that leads to pressures to marry. So you'd combine it thematically, and that's fine. That's
Thank you.
completely okay. That's how you triangulate data.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Basudev, for asking a question. Moving ahead, Samiksha has asked that in what ways can we elaborate one case study, say one particular health issue, and bring in the narratives of other people pertaining to the issue? So, how to add the narratives together?
So you're doing one case study, but you're also doing other interviews, or you're
I s- Samiksha, would you want to ask your question by unmuting yourself just to explain it a little bit more?
or do you mean other people? Go on.
Yes, so no, not just one case study. There are with pertaining to this one particular health issue that I'm working on, which is hysterectomy. I did 8 in-depth interviews, and then I want to weave in the narrative together because some of the experiences are very similar. So how do you like? But I want to go it about by talking about one particular person and then weave in the narrative from different interviews as well. Like, can that be possible, or how to do that?
That's possible, but what you then do is you'd work with that one story, and where there's particular aspects that are affirmed through other people's accounts, you would talk about how this theme came up, or this particular, I'm no longer a woman, I don't feel like a woman because I don't have a womb, or something like that. There's a long account which talks about her and self constructions of womanhood. And then you might weave, uh, when you're explaining this is what's underneath it, what does it mean to be a woman, and then talk about this was a theme that came up in several accounts, and then use little extracts from others.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Samiksha. Going ahead, Dr. Sejal has asked, in my field for the study, where I am doing qualitative research, there are two tribes who speak different languages. The interview needs to be transcribed from one tribal language to another and then translated to English. So the transcription in two tribal languages and translation should all be verbatim. That's the question.
Yeah. So, I mean, I do interviews in Hindi, in English combined. So ultimately it gets transcribed. But sometimes in the process of transcription, I try and keep some keywords. Some words are just not translatable. So sometimes in bracket, I write the exact turn of phrase so that I don't forget. And maybe sometimes later, the exact way in which to translate that phrase becomes clearer in its context. So I've started, and I haven't always done this, I've started seeing the value. So the next research project I do, I'm going to do this more, is keep more of the original phrases in the transcription. So it's just you learn all the time, right? So that's something that I'm thinking about now, is that next time I do it, I need to figure out how to keep more of that phrasing. But you
Thank you
would
so
have
much.
forgotten. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think we move to next question, which is from Agin, which is, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name. In my research, I came across some documents that is mentioned as not for public use, but available online. What should I do about these documents if these are relevant? Ethical or legal considerations, any suggestions that may be possible in this regard?
So you find out who the owner of that data is, and then you seek permission. Yeah, so if it's sensitive data, you have to be very careful. Just because something's available publicly doesn't mean that there are no ethical issues. So, say comments or Twitter accounts which may be public, and people's comments underneath it. Increasingly, it's not seen. The practice is not to see that as public data, because if you use the exact words and then you back search it on Google, you may be able to trace who said that. Yeah. So often what in ethics, which is particularly on the use of comments on online forums and things, the ethical step is to to think about how might you anonymize the data by not using the exact a long code which can be traced back to the source. So you would do tests on your extracts to see if it can be traced back to the source. And if it can be, then you've compromised the anonymity of someone who put it on a public forum but didn't put it on
Hmm.
didn't know that could be used for research.
I hope that helps you again and gives you some direction. Professor Shalini has asked, what kind of practices help in evaluating yourself in how you are looking at your data, the biases that may come, and B, sharpening your understanding of the context in which your data is making meaning? So,
So one
yeah, go
practice
ahead.
is to think about, so biases aren't so the word bias is a problem. Everyone has a bias. You can't have be free of bias. I'd say positionality. So you need to think about your own positionality in terms of analyzing your data. So I remember, so maybe I'll talk about, if we do a life history interviews, I'll talk about it. So in my book, Striking Women, which is on work and uh, strikes by South Asian workers, I remember a little extract where this woman was, so I'm like this middle class person, right, in a job and all of that. So I'm talking to working class women who work in factories, went on strike. So this woman tells me, and then I decided to stand for a shop steward, so union rep. I don't know if that is that a term that's used in India, union rep. So it's the representative of the union on
Yes.
your thing.
Yeah.
So my immediate question was, did you ask your husband? And she said, what's there to ask him? This is not a general election to discuss. And later, when I was looking at the data, I immediately was struck by my own assumption of her lack of agency, and that any decision about standing to be a union rep has to be agreed by her husband. And she put me in my place, and it really made me think about the assumptions I had about my own agency and her lack of agency. And so I wrote that into the analysis in terms of what's going on, why am I asking this question. So you think about your positionality and how it's influencing how you approach your research, what you ask, what you don't ask. And a really strong piece of work we've certain. You don't just talk about positionality in your methods and never again. So in our current research, we're talking about often what's going on when people say this to us. Why do we think they're saying this to us rather than this is what they're saying. So in the current research on transnational marriage abandonment, these men who've left women to care for their mothers or parents and are never coming back to India, the women are talking about the violence by the mother-in-law, but saying he didn't know anything about it, or if he knew, he would have done something. So I'm thinking, why are they obscuring the complicity, or more than that, at the minimum, the complicity, or more commonly, the active involvement of their husband in the violence and abuse? He's the one who's left them behind. And part of it, I'm thinking, is at the end of the interview, when I asked many women, what would you like to happen after 3 hours of telling us how abusive he was and the family was, they said, we'd like the marriage to be restored. So I'm trying to understand not just that, oh, they want the marriage to be restored, what's going on? I'm trying to understand in what world is this the best option in their mind. So, in a context where they are confronted with different forms of structural and interpersonal violence, is my analysis, in that this interpersonal violence becomes the most tolerable option. And it's that context in which the hope to join the husband abroad is the, that hope means that they're obscuring his complicity in the abuse and foregrounding the in-laws complicity, because migration to join him would mean the end to all of this and the start of a family life. So you have to analyze what's going on in relation to what they're telling you, but also what's happening in that context of the your positionality. How does that shape what you're asking, what you're able to ask, how you approach?
Thank you so much, Professor. I think that was a very useful response and very helpful. There's Chiru has asked um, that while doing iterative data analysis, I often find myself questioning if I'm reading the data right, when or where my interpretations of data become over interpretations of it, etc. How can we ensure that it's emerging from the data itself and not over reading into it?
That's just experience. So there is no master answer to that. So the thing is, it's qualitative analysis. Different people will interpret it differently. So there isn't a right answer. There is no right way of interpreting that data. So I don't have an easy answer to that. So it's your sense of, I think you have to, when you read around the scholarship, you get a sense of to what extent are you affirming. There's a lot that's familiar and similar to other findings, and there's some that's new. So you get a sense of what's new and why it's new and what's familiar, and all research does both those things. And that's one way in which you get a sense of, is your interpretation okay. Sometimes you wonder whether you're reading too much, and so, for example, a lot of the scholarship on domestic violence, for example, doesn't read neglect or what's seen as violence is defined in a very boundaried way. So, in this research on, say, transnational marriage abandonment, some women who managed to go abroad to join their husband, the men refused to eat the food cooked by her. Now, in a Western context, that would not be seen as violence. So, so, but women's accounts constructed it as harm. So now I'm thinking it was significant because it came up again and again. And so I've analyzed it in the context of scholarship in sociology on doing family and how men are undoing family through refusing to eat food cooked by her. So I've then analyzed it outside the frame of reference of domestic violence that typically deployed and drawn upon the notions of harm and doing and undoing of family in that context. I still am not sure if I could interpret it as violence, but it's important for me to think about harm and subjective experiences of harm.
Absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense of how even wider reading and with experience, you even yourself begin to see data in very different light. And over a period of time, also how you see the same data changes so much based on your experience in reading and moving across institutions. So Vijaypal has asked, I know we are closing in on time, so I'll just quickly try to do this. There are three questions, and we'll not take any more after that. So sorry for anybody who had questions further. So Vijaypal has asked that, can you please comment on how to do, because of NCERT books being in news recently, how to do content analysis of textbooks, the space given to specific kingdom, women's take, comparing it with old books, etc.
So because the books are on such a wide variety of topics, you'd have to narrow in on a theme first. So you would say, if you're looking at history, you would look at a particular historical event or a theme that's within history. So you'd have to narrow it down to a very specific theme, and then you would do analysis of how these themes are depicted. And you could also do, so you'd have to do, yeah, it'd be two textual analysis of the themes that are depicted, and then you could also have a comparative element of the previous edition before this particular edition came, and how I'm assuming the syllabus doesn't change overall. So you would then use the same syllabus as the starting point and say how this thing migration in the syllabus was interpreted before this government came to alter the textbooks, and how it's interpreted later. So it will be a comparative as well as a content analysis. So that would be more effective if to make that bring across that political point of the shift over time. But you'd have to really make sure you narrow your field.
Yeah, yes, I hope that helps, Vijaypal. So we have next question in which Manisha is asking us. Basically, the question is about for students who don't have access to softwares and who have data which is very varied and they have a lot of variability of data that they're dealing with. Is there any other sources that are available through which they can analyze it much more easily if they don't have access to any of the softwares?
So if you don't have access to any software, you can do the Word version of highlighting bits of text. So what then I'd do is I'd create a Word document with all my quotes as the content page, and then with link in Word document you can attach link from your title page to the section of the book, yeah, or section of the document. So then I would code under each. I would extract texts under each code, but they will be like chapters of my book. Does that make sense? And that will be the basic NVivo format, or the replicating the NVivo format that I could design. And then when so for example, for my current research, there's a code on economic abuse, and then that code generated several subcodes of different forms of economic abuse. So then that would be my title thing, and then subtitles, and each bits of text would fall into it, and or social reproduction abuse related to, which was something else I'm doing on Polish women's experiences of domestic violence. There are different forms of control around depriving them of food, the domestic labor that they were expected. So those are so I just put each quote in that subsection, and then I can click on the contents page and reach that section of the quote. So at the end of the day, if I'm writing a whole article on social reproduction, I will copy and paste that whole section into something else, and then edit those quotes till they are manageable. So I often start with like 120 pages of that, of quotes on social reproduction. And initially, I will just go through it and edit each thing. I'll come to 50 pages, and then it's more manageable to read through those 50 pages. And then they're already in sub themes, right? So within those sub themes, some of them will become, I'll realize it's not working. Some of them I'll merge. So at each stage, it becomes smaller and smaller. So in the end, I have 20 pages of data, and that's when I start writing. Because by then I've arrived at these are the three themes I want to cover in this article, and some of them I'll discard because there's not enough about it, or it's on the fringes of relevance. So you can do it with Word document. It's remarkably similar if you organize it this way to how NVivo works.
Yeah. I hope that is helpful to them. Also, just to flag, I'm not sure, but Atlas TI, the last I knew, was a free software, which is also one of the softwares which allows you to code large volumes of data. You can check and see if it works for you. It is Atlas TI. I can put the name on the chat box. The last question, Professor, is that there's a student, they are saying they're planning, Vidisha, they're planning to get a response to a video from a few of my friends and teachers. So apparently that's the kind of work that they're doing, research. What methods they can keep in mind while doing this? I just want to put this question also as a large blanket question as to how much thought should go into data analysis, the methods of data analysis when we are conceiving our research at initial stages.
Completely, because if you don't have if you don't give thought to that, you won't be gathering the data appropriately. So immediately what comes to my mind is, so look at GADD's work on I think it was called This Is Abuse, or it was about young men's understandings of a video which was produced to raise awareness about domestic violence in young men's perpetration of domestic violence. So what GAD did was he got a group of young men to come together and then showed them the video, and then organized a focus group like questions about the video, but also initially started with them talking about what was going on in that video. And it's a really interesting piece of work. What it does is what focus groups don't often do. So often focus groups are used by students as an easy shortcut to gathering data. Instead of bothering to do semi-structured interviews with 20 people, they'll do two focus groups with 10 people each, and they think they've got it and do a thematic analysis. And that really irks me. The point of focus group is to get the interactive data. So the point of bringing people together to talk about something is to see how they interact and talk about this topic, and it's that interaction which is your data. So when focus group is used in the form of semi-structured interviews and to derive themes, it is really a poor use of focus groups. It's a convenience thing rather than the method. So there I would get them to watch that video and have them talking about it and see how they what are the conversations, how do they collectively generate meaning from that, and how that meaning shifts if it does. So these young men in that research, they looked at this video and started off with, oh, what a horrible guy he is, he's doing this to his girlfriend. And then gradually their position shifted to aligning with and identifying with the man, saying, oh, poor guy, he's going to get done for rape, isn't he? Oh, but that, and gradually that shifting position was really interesting, was what was analyzed. So does this something like this work or not? So I thought that was an excellent use of focus groups. So you could do that.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think those are the questions that we had. I cannot thank you enough for how detailed you have gone with this session. So meticulous and so much efforts and time you have put into this. And I'm very, very sure this has been very helpful, especially because these are the conversations which are missing from our research training. So glad that you put your time and efforts into doing this. Really grateful. And I hope it was helpful for